The Bancroft Library has a truly great, wonderfully deep collection for the study of Mexican history, and I'm happy to chair a session that celebrates the collection and its uses. The Bancroft was important to my own research long before I arrived as a faculty member 8 years ago. Here in 1979, I launched a study of priests in their parishes in 18th century Mexico and stumbled on a book that truly opened the subject for me. It's called El Itinerario para Párrocos de Indios. It's a thick moral theology text, one that was designed to instruct American priests entering pastoral service among Indians. It's not a particularly scarce book. In fact, you could call it a bestseller for its time. It went through 7 editions between 1668 and 1771, and it's not unusual to find copies showing up on the rare book market still today. What made the Bancroft copy so important to me was its annotations by a Mexican priest at just the time in the mid-18th century when the role of the pastor was reconceived by the Bourbon monarchy. The various editions of this book and the Bancroft's annotated copy became my touchstone for how parish priests imagined their responsibilities in a time of great change and how they felt thwarted and confused. The Bancroft Library is even more important to me as a vast reservoir with which to think about Mexican history in ways that I can share directly with students. If there were time, I would tell you about riches like the Codex Fernandez Leal, a mysterious pictorial record from Oaxaca that helps undergraduates understand how certain Native American groups reckoned with the Spanish colonial system of law and justice in the 16th century. Instead, let me mention one little-known manuscript in the collection that I find even more compelling for helping students imagine themselves as historians and discover something of their own in the written record of the time. The document is an Inquisition investigation into bigamy committed by a Basque immigrant who made his way to a little mining settlement in north-central Mexico in the 1570s and took a second wife there. This case contains something more intriguing than scandal. Tucked into the file is a group of letters that the erstwhile bigamist sent back to his first wife and other relatives in Spain shortly after he arrived, describing his life and fortunes on the edge of the Spanish Empire as colonial towns were just then forming. 3 undergraduates in one of my lecture courses worked with me to transcribe, translate, and interpret these letters for other members of the class. And we all trooped over to the stone room one afternoon so that everyone could see for themselves and talk about how those letters open a window onto the first years of colonial settlement. On that occasion, as on so many others, David Kessler, Walter Brehm, Jack Von Oy, Susan Snyder, Tony Bliss, Biba Strads, Iris Donovan, Teresa Salazar, Erica Nordmeyer, and other Bancroft Library colleagues helped me do this. So the Bancroft Library has become my favorite home on the UC Berkeley campus, my teaching laboratory, and bottomless well of human experience in Mexico since the 16th century. For this morning's event, I've asked 3 colleagues in the Latin American History PhD program to give you a glimpse of their ambitious dissertation projects or teaching strategies that have, like mine, grown from research in the Bancroft Library. We're running a little short on time. You have their names and the titles of their presentations this morning in the program. Let me just identify them in the order in which they'll speak. To my left is Jessica Delgado. Next to Jessica is Rachel Chico. And next to Rachel is Sean McEnroe. I should note that both Rachel and Jessica have held Bancroft Library fellowships, and that Jessica served for a year as the assistant to the curator of Latin Americana. Jessica?
One of the greatest strengths of the Bancroft's Mexican holdings is its collection of original manuscripts from the Mexican Inquisition. I've had the opportunity to work extensively with this collection, both as the curatorial assistant to the unstoppable Walter Brem, who's the director of the Latin American collections, and in my own research on women in the church in colonial Mexico, for which Inquisition documents make up an important part. So what I'd like to do is talk just briefly about the collection in general in terms of what it has to offer students and scholars, and then give a little more detail about some of the work that I did in the Bancroft. And finally, I'd like to end by sharing a story that's taken from a particularly fascinating case about an exceptional woman as an example of the kinds of things that we can learn from these documents. The Bancroft Library owns roughly 120 original manuscripts from the Mexican Inquisition. This probably makes it the largest collection of original Mexican Inquisition manuscripts outside of Mexico, certainly the largest in the United States. These volumes cover the period from 1593, just 2 decades after the Inquisition was established in Mexico, all the way up to 1817. The Bancroft collection is representative of Inquisition documents in general in the sense that it includes the full range of crimes tried by the Inquisition. The Bancroft collection includes 6 of the most famous and dramatic cases against what have come to be known as crypto-Jews, along with cases of bigamy, superstition, witchcraft, false visions, a whole range of sexual misconduct and doctrinal errors, and in particular a rich collection of trials against priests for abusing the sacraments. And I can't talk about the Inquisition collection without mentioning, I think, the most bizarre case I've ever seen, which is an over 200-page case against a priest for officiating in the marriage of 2 dogs. The Bancroft's collection is also unique in that, with the exception of just a few documents, all of the volumes represent nearly complete procesos, or trial records. They are very well preserved, and as you can see by this example, comparatively speaking, I'm not sure you can see it that well from there, but believe me, comparatively speaking, it's beautifully legible, very, very easy to read. As anyone who has worked with the 1,555 volumes of Inquisition documents at the National Archive in Mexico can tell you, the Mexican Inquisition produced a huge amount of paper, a huge amount of documentation, but a large amount of that is in the form of denunciations and collections of testimonies that are organized by crime, perhaps for a particular year, a particular place, and a large percentage of that never made it to a trial. So to have a manageable collection that's large but manageable, of well-preserved, beautifully legible, nearly complete procesos is really a wonderful opportunity for students and scholars. For those of us, when we were beginning our research, it allowed us to get a sense of, a kind of comparative sense of the different kinds of trials, what we could learn from them, and it allowed us to learn, it allows students really to learn about the structure of Inquisition trials themselves, which is often difficult to get a sense of from the other kind of more fragmentary records. Working deeply in this way with individual trials is particularly important to those of us who are interested in colonial women's history. My work specifically looks at the social, spiritual, and material relationship between lay women and the church, and Inquisition documents are invaluable for this kind of work. My work is just a part of a larger trend in Inquisition studies that is moving from looking at the inner workings of the Inquisition to trying to understand the role of the Inquisition in Mexican society, to looking deeply at individual trials to think about what we can gain from them in terms of information about ordinary people, about their lives, about their practices and their beliefs. In recent decades, Inquisition trials have become an important way for a number of scholars to study what they have called mentalities, for which gender, sexuality, and women's position vis-a-vis the church are important components. There are also increasing numbers of article length and chapter length studies that piece together individual life stories from particularly rich trials and try to learn about the world in which these people lived. Many of these stories have been about women. My work with the Bancroft Inquisition collection focused largely on women's testimonies in cases in which they were not the ones on trial, but rather testifying as witnesses or the accused. The characteristics of the Bancroft collection meant that I could easily find and read all of the manuscripts in which women testified, and this wouldn't have been possible in some of the other collections. In doing so, I discovered that trials against priests for the crime known as solicitation were gold mines for learning about women's relationship to the church, and I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about what that crime was and why it's particularly useful for me. Solicitation was defined as a priest making a sexual advance in word or deed during confession. The Inquisition considered solicitation a very serious crime because it undermined the sacrament of confession, which the Church saw as essential to its efforts in the New World. It was a key moment in which the Church could intervene in the lives, beliefs, and behavior of its parishioners. For this reason, the Inquisition was very concerned with rooting out soliciting priests, to do so, they set up a mechanism by which large numbers of women ended up testifying against their confessors. I should say that two things. Some women did denounce their professors on their own, but their professors, their confessors on their own. But in my research, I found that most of these women were nuns, and there's interesting reasons why that might be the case. And the other thing I should say is that I'm speaking as if this mechanism only caught women and if only women testified against their confessors. But in fact, there are cases of men having been solicited by priests, and I have a couple of colleagues who are working on that subject, but what I've gotten the sense of from them is that it's far more rare. And some of that, not necessarily that it's rare that it happened, but it's rare that these denunciations come forward. And that may have something to do with this mechanism. But this mechanism that I'm describing is that priests were encouraged to ask their, I'm assuming, female penitents during confession whether or not in the past they had ever been solicited by a former confessor. If the penitent said yes, then the priest said, I'm sorry, we have to stop right here. You will need to denounce formally your confessor before the Inquisition before I'm able to absolve you of your sins. And I can take a dictation right now and turn it in myself, or you can go and appear to the local representative of the Inquisition. But you can't get what you came here for until you do that. So this obviously encouraged a large number of women to testify when they may not have otherwise spoken up. Once this denunciation was made, the central office of the Inquisition in Mexico City would decide if the situation warranted an investigation. If there was an investigation, a great many more women might be compelled to testify in the same way. And then, even though these investigations were supposed to be secret, quite frequently the person who was accused got wind of what was going on and may have tried to use a strategy of supposedly spontaneous self-denunciation to gain a little bit more mercy from the court. Since the person who was accused didn't know what the court knew and what they didn't, these self-denunciations frequently named a lot more women than the court already knew about. Then all of these women would be called forth to testify. So you can see why these cases are gold mines for me. Then once the women were testifying, since they were not on trial and the Inquisition was hoping to gather as much information as possible, the examiners tended to ask very broad questions about the women's relationship with priests, about their experience with confession. And so that makes these testimonies especially rich for my topic in terms of women's relationship to priests and their understandings of the sacraments. And because confession was undertaken as preparation for the sacrament of communion, I've found that women frequently speak about the meaning of communion, the sacrament of communion in their lives. Now, I would like to finish up with an example of what can be learned about the life of an individual woman from the Bancroft Inquisition collection. And this is one of the first pages of that comes from that case. This is the case of Maria Anastacia Gonzalez, who lived in the Mexican town of Sayula in the late 18th century. She first came to the attention of the Inquisition as a witness testifying against her former confessor, but because of her testimony, she ended up on trial herself for false visions and suspicion of various heresies and pacts with the devil. She was actually accused of 15 heresies by the time they were done. Maria Anastacia married extremely young and gave birth to 11 children, many of whom died. Ever since she was a child, she had experienced visions and heard the voice of God, but it wasn't until after she was married and saddled with the responsibility of children that she discerned that for her, these experiences were a call to lead the life of religious devotion and celibacy. At this point, it was too late to make that choice, and all of the clergymen that she spoke with told her that she had to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother, and that to do otherwise would have been a breach of the sacrament of marriage. So in her 20s, she entered into a period of severe spiritual crisis in which she searched for guidance in the form of a confessor that would understand her spiritual longings. One day in prayer, she heard the voice of God directing her specifically to Father Zendejas. She sought him out and began a 5-year relationship with him, in which he was the first priest to ever validate her spiritual experiences. It seems, however, that Father Zendejas abused her trust and may have feigned acceptance of her visions in order to create the kind of relationship with her that he wanted. About a year into their relationship, he began ordering her to perform often bizarre and physically abusive sexual acts with him as a part of her penance, telling her that these were spiritual exercises designed to teach her discipline, obedience, and humility. At first she had her doubts, but eventually she decided that since God had directed her to Father Zendejas, and she trusted her direct communication with God, that whatever transpired with Zendejas must be a part of God's plan. Father Zendejas managed to keep his relationship with Maria Anastacia a secret until a few years after he moved to Guadalajara and ended his relationship with her, when someone else denounced him for similar behavior. Through the process I described earlier, an investigation began, and eventually Father Zendejas came forward with a self-denunciation that described in pages of graphic, very incriminating language the relationship he had with Maria Anastacia. So Maria Anastacia was called forward to testify. By this time, her husband had died, and she had taken up the habit of a beata, an informal holy woman, was known in her community for her visions and her piety, and was finally leading the life that she'd always wanted to lead. But this ended when she was called to testify before the local representatives of the Inquisition, because what she said and did in her testimony shocked them. She insisted that Father Zendejas was innocent because God had directed her to him. This infuriated and scandalized her examiners, and their questions became more intense and accusing. Eventually, Maria Anastacia fell into a trance, saw visions of Jesus, and began speaking in strange voices. It took 3 days to complete her testimony, and after it was finished, her examiners denounced her to the Inquisition. The Inquisition took this denunciation very seriously and began a decade-long investigation and trial, for much of which Maria Anastacia was held in the secret prisons of the Inquisition. She never changed her interpretation and was eventually sentenced to exile and imprisonment in a hospital for women, where she was supposed to perform penance. She died before her sentence was completed, however, and the clergyman in charge of the hospital did not know whether to give her a Christian burial, because although she had shown extreme devotion in her spiritual exercises and caring for the other women in the hospital, she consistently refused to confess to the sins that the Inquisition had accused her of. Another priest was brought in who tried using physical punishment, after which she began to refuse food. Soon after this, she died, insisting up to the last moment that God knew she was innocent. In addition to the dramatic encounter with church authority and the sort of startling sense of faith in her own experience of the divine that we learned from Maria Anastacia's trial, we also gained from this case a surprising amount of information about her life circumstances and her vision of the world. This is just one of many such women's stories found in the Bancroft Inquisition collection. Mary Giles, in the introduction to her book, Women in the Inquisition, beautifully and provocatively describes the possibilities for women's history found in these kinds of documents, and I would like to leave you with this quote. Women step forward like ghosts in a dream to claim existence and identity in the reader's imagination. Poignant reminder that survival on any terms is tenuous, the portraits are at the same time testimony to the creativity of scholars who, in the tedium of research, effect for these women a kind of resurrection. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. My name's Rachel Chico, and I'm just finishing up my last year here at Berkeley as a PhD student in the history department. And my talk today, I'm sorry? Louder? Okay. Well, my talk today is going to address my experiences navigating undergraduates to the Bancroft Library and through the choppy waters of documentary interpretation. However, I should first make a confession. I am an awful navigator. It is a failing to which I was biologically fated. I realize now that the meandering car trips I took with my mother were in fact not intended to be so circuitous. If the journey was the destination, then we were indeed on course. However, if the destination was the destination, well, we were more times than not in trouble. It's for this reason that when I started graduate school, I was so glad that the Bancroft Library rested just to the west of that North Star on campus, the Campanile. I needed only stroll up the long paved avenue from Shattuck Avenue to reach a destination known. 5 years later, I was putting together the syllabus for a seminar on travelers and traveling in Latin America. I decided that this journey to the Bancroft was precisely the type of expedition that should be worked into our battery of activities. For the writing assignment associated with this expedition, I took as a touchstone an assignment I had received in my first graduate seminar here at Berkeley. In that seminar, Professor William Taylor set us upon the Bancroft's rich collections of Inquisition cases. The cases ran many pages in length. They touched upon censored works of satire and acts of alleged witchcraft, as well as, most memorably to my mind, the magical powers of a small, dead bird. They were documents with infinite implications, and yet we were charged with writing a 3-page paper on them. It was excruciating. However, the sheaves of paper that circulated in seminar the following week had a distilled quality about them. They packed a potent punch. The observations we had made were pithy and yet broad-minded. My seminar compatriots and I found that the Inquisition was an organization that was eminently pragmatic, and that therefore meant that it was not always entirely thorough. I decided to emulate this bracing scholarly exercise and excellent introduction to the Bancroft in my own class. However, my students were allowed 5 pages instead of 3. Now, whether the undergraduates perceived of this as largesse or not, of course, remains open for debate. But in reality, it was an easier task than my colleagues and I were assigned as graduate students. Students in the class were informed on the syllabus that they would be examining those tools that individuals had at their disposal in orienting themselves. These tools in this case referred to the rich and varied map collection of the Bancroft Library. Today we are going to look at a few of the maps that the students of History 103, Travelers and Traveling in Latin America, addressed in their papers. I think this is especially appropriate at an event celebrating the Bancroft Centennial. It illustrates that the surprise and intimidation of discovery is constant at this library. I hope you experience some of the sense of happy discovery and perhaps some of the interpretational inadequacy that any student of history would at his or her first initial glance at these documents. The first map that we're looking at here dates from 1607 to 1608. It's published by a Swedish publisher in Amsterdam named Jodocus Ondius. Now, the first thing that the junior history major noticed about this document was its fantastical animals. Let's switch forward here for a moment. We can see here these animals are sort of a combination between beavers and fish, presumably. They're part of a landscape that is truly unique, in that we see the way that the Americas are manifesting themselves in the European mind only a few years after the arrival of Europeans to the New World. The student also looked closely at the sort of surrounding context that we get in this map. We see the Europeans are closing in on the New World, and closing in on a New World that is thoroughly unknown to them, thus the appearance of the beaverfish, and further here, the sort of giant marine life. The second map that I assigned to a senior history major, who's in fact now in the graduate program here, is a depiction of Veracruz. Now, Veracruz is close to my heart. I deal with it in my dissertation very much, and the Bancroft has informed my own research deeply. This particular image has its legend in English, and the legend, the caption up there reads, "The flotilla or little fleet sails annually from Cadiz for this port, except in time of war, and is laden with woolen cloths and stuff of England, the linen and lace of Holland and Flanders, and silks of Italy and France, the muslins, silks, and calicoes of the East Indies, the merchandise of China, Persia, and Turkey, of which the English, Dutch, Italians, and French are proprietors, so that the Spaniards are only in a matter their factors. They sell their cargoes at this fair of La Veracruz, and receive in lieu the gold and silver of Mexico, with the precious stones and other treasures of the East Indies, paying 1/5 duty to the King of Spain." Now, Melissa Galvan, the graduate student here currently, looked closely at this image and closely at that caption to make conclusions about the role that Veracruz played as the primary international port on the east coast of Mexico. She looked closely at the way in which the grid pattern of Veracruz figured centrally into this image, really communicating the sort of impact that the Spanish had on urban organization in the New World. Let's look at the next image. The last image is not from Mexico, it's in fact from Peru. This image dates from the 18th century and depicts the city of Lima. It's particularly a rich image because we see here that there's a legend at the top here, and it's difficult to magnify, so I'll just describe it. The legend tells us where churches were located in Lima, and the junior history major that utilized this image noticed that there were a telling number of churches over the river. She thought deeply about why this may be and realized that Lima was expanding and perhaps surmised that they were trying to draw people over the river. Now, I have to say that students of any age first encounter with a document at the Bancroft may represent a fleeting moment of, as I said, interpretational inadequacy. However, I truly believe that it should not represent a moment of methodological paralysis. Now, I believe that primary documents are indispensable to student research. However, their use brings with it considerable obligations. I find that most students early in their study of any subject, and I include myself in this category, crave a narrative. Primary research involves encountering a cacophony of historical voices for some periods and a cricket's chirping atmosphere for others. While I dispatched students to complete another assignment during this class, examining what travelers don't say as revelatory, I think these silences can be populated, albeit sparsely, by the enterprising interpretation of documents. In order to encourage students to begin to do this, I passed out rubrics of questions by which students could submit documents to a rigorous regimen of interrogation. Indeed, I encouraged students to conceive of images and maps in particular as rich sources that have much more potential than being merely illustrative. I encouraged them to look at the images that we've seen today as texts and place them both in a historical context and also in a spatial context. I think that this illustrates to students that the Bancroft has within its collections not merely old books, but old ways of conceiving of space and place. Thank you.
Did that on the plane?
Yeah.
I got distracted in the beginning of Kevin Starr's keynote address because he brought up a way of thinking about the history of cities and the history of the people in those cities that works so well with the topic I'm about to discuss, which is the settlement of northern New Spain and the beginning of Mexican municipalities in the 19th century. He asked us to think a little bit about the way that Mumford or Bancroft thought about the relationship between knowledge and space. The idea that a library as a taxonomy of organizing the world actually replicates itself in the plan of a city in some ways if the people planning the city think like a library. And what I'd like to explore using some documents from the Bancroft is the ways in which Spaniards' taxonomies for human beings influenced their way of settling space in northern New Spain in the 17th and 18th and even the early 19th centuries. I began this investigation with some documents that Professor Taylor pointed out to me, some mission documents from the town of Hualahuises, which is located in Nuevo León in a zone that is very close to Texas today, but was once the extreme northern frontier. My comments are going to address Tlaxcalans and Spaniards that moved into this area in the beginning of the 19th century. The interaction of these settlers with local people that were first drawn down forcibly in some cases to work in mines or on plantations, is a complex story of the interaction of old and new settlers from different places in the same geography. This story is also about nomads that continued to move through the region well into the 19th century. I'm going to give special attention to the time right at the end of the colonial period when some of those taxonomies of space and the organization of different ethnic groups start to break down and be replaced by a new Mexican state-level organization. The title of this talk, Between Aztecs and Apaches, is meant to indicate the intermediary position of Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcalans are people, you may remember them from the conquest of Mexico, the next-door neighbors of the Aztecs, vital to Cortez in the conquest of Mexico, and vital to Spaniards later on in the Chichimeca Wars to the north, and to a campaign to settle untamed areas through the creation of small military garrisons or militia towns and missions in which they live side by side with local peoples. In a physical sense, the Tlaxcalans were between the Spanish center and the uncontrolled north. In a cultural sense, they also occupied a middle position. Spaniards considered the Tlaxcalan to be Indios, but they also considered them to be civilized Indios, in contrast to northern Indians that they considered to be barbarians. The Tlaxcalans formed mission towns with the newly settled Chichimecs, and they were often platted out in two equal parts. The Tlaxcalans were envisioned by the Spaniards to be emissaries, carriers of culture, to the non-Hispanicized people of the north. One of the missions that was established in this way is the town of San Cristobal, and I want to examine it with you through some of the documents that are available in the Bancroft collection. Nuevo Leon is marked on the map there. Hualahuises is found in the sort of center of that space. When I arrived in Hualahuises last summer, I was treated to a couple of jokes about the taxonomy of people and about physical space. I asked some guys at a restaurant what they knew about the history of the town, and I got two jokes at my expense. One was, well, I don't know much about the history of the town, but let me tell you something. Do you know how to get from here, Hualahuises, to Linares? And I said, no. And the guy said, it's that way, and then laughed at me. Then the next thing I said was, well, is there anyone around here who does know much about the history of the town? And he said, oh yeah, I'll go get my friend. He's muy indio. I'll get my friend, he's very Indian. Both of these jokes are actually quite telling, because the reason Hualahuises is sitting in the middle of a municipality has everything to do with the history of who is Indian and who is not Indian. These two guys, to me, looked exactly the same. And it was a great reminder of the fact that Indianness in Mexico is not really a biological condition. It is a cultural category. This is Hualahuises today. Okay. Hualahuises was first settled as a congrega in the 17th century. Sort of forcibly, the Indians were taken down to labor on Spanish land, but it also became a mission directed by Franciscans. And shortly it became part of a scheme of colonization in which Tlaxcalans from the center, indicated by the lowest oval there, cooperated with the Spanish in the north. And these heavy red lines indicate the route of migration to the north of these Tlaxcalans. First to San Luis Potosí and then to Saltillo in 1591. And then the dotted lines indicate the migrations to places like Hualahuises, these smaller towns in Nuevo Leon. Here's part of the riddle of why Hualahuises is located inside of Linares. This is a 1715 map. It's actually a copy of a 1715 map that shows the relationship between the two settlements. At the center is the mission of San Cristobal Hualahuises, and in the lower right-hand corner is the emergent town of Linares as they stood in 1715. Today, you can see that the town has sort of dwarfed the mission. And yet, the mission has itself turned into a municipality and survived in the midst of its larger neighbor. To return to the question of taxonomies of space and race in the north, here is a map that shows, it's from 1794, it's a military map. It shows the way that Spaniards thought about the different people that lived in the north. You'll note that there are no sharp administrative boundaries. It's more that different kinds of institutions can exist side by side and be understood as having discrete functions. So you have square boxes that represent presidios. You have these little churches with steeples on top of them that represent Spanish towns or perhaps emergent parishes. We have the little circles with the crosses atop them that represent missions. And beyond the missions, we see other groups of Indians represented in ways that let us know that they are not yet completely settled or not yet completely within the mission system. All of the settlements there that are circled are ones that I've studied through the Bancroft and then subsequently through the archives of Nuevo León in Monterrey. And each one of them has a distinctive pattern of transformation during the years that New Spain turned into Mexico and during the years that missions and presidios, pueblos de indios and pueblos de españoles, turned into municipalities. This was my first introduction to the subject. Professor Taylor pointed out to me both a collection of documents from Montemorelos and one from Hualahuises. And this is a very typical page from those resources. This collection has 2 volumes, one of which is the accounts of the assets of a church and its ritual objects, and the other one is a set of accounts of incomes and expenditures for the mission of San Cristobal Hualahuises. You get to see, in looking at this sort of document, the whole structure of local authority interacting with outside forms of authority. So we see here that the entire mission is overseen by the governor of the region, but we can also see that the people presenting the documentation to the governor from inside the mission have a certain kind of legal standing. Most importantly, this collection of documents from Hualahuises runs from 1793 until the 1830s, meaning that this one book contains the pre- and post-independence period records for this town. So at least on paper, the early part of the book treats the description of a mission that's made up half of Tlaxcalans and half of these other Indians from the region. And by the time you get to the end of the book, its entries purport to show us the normal municipal records of a town. So this is a very rare opportunity in one set of bindings. I don't know if it was just a result of scarcity of paper or just the extreme continuity of institutions. We can actually read this transition from the Spanish way of organizing the political order of the North to the new Mexican municipal way of understanding it. This one marked in the corners are expenditures and incomes. Here we have a clue as to the structure of authority in these missions. To the left, we have the person who is the protector in the valley, a person who would serve as a intermediary between the Spanish population and the Indian one, and one who oversees the books. To the right is the signature of the Franciscan friar, and at the bottom we have the signature of one of the members of the Cabildo, the native council of the mission, who is the scribe and also serves as a sort of witness. Here's the moment of transition. This purports to be at the top here an account of the assets and the expenditures of what is now the Pueblo de San Cristobal de los Hualahuises. And it is being prepared by somebody who is called the alcalde. This is a whole new set of offices than those that existed before. And yet, if we actually track the names that were on that last set of signatures from the beginning to the end of the book, we can actually see a high level of continuity. We have some of the same individual people in the new government as the old. Here you can see that the account books from the period after independence look extremely similar to the ones beforehand, as do the signatures. Now here is the thing that first caught my attention and propelled me in my current research. In the midst of these records, we see an accounting not just of goods, but an accounting of people. And by the way, librarians in the room, I have not actually highlighted these rare documents. This is I did this on PowerPoint. I would not be welcome at this exhibition. You can see here that the population statistics are given, and in the top line highlighted, we have the Indios Tlaxcaltecas, the Indians that have come as colonizers in some sense from the center of Mexico. Beneath them, we have two groups of people, one described as the Indios de la Nueva Conversión, the newly converted Indians, and another curious group, the Antiguos Borrados. If you go back to earlier records, they're a group of people just referred to as the Borrados. So we have the Tlaxcalans, we have the newly settled people, and we have the people that are now called the old members of the Borrado tribe, the settled ones. And my contention about the way that mission towns like this one works is that they are, in some sense, a social machinery by which some group of people passes from being Indians of the new conversion to Indians of the old conversion, and then, interestingly enough, in some cases aspires to a status, both legally and socially, that the Tlaxcalans have already charted out in the eyes of Spanish leaders. This is a very curious passage from the same text, and this gives you some idea of how the local Spanish overseers, the protectores, may have viewed what was going on between these different populations. Essentially what it says is, he's laying out his account books and telling what happened last year. It says, the Indians of the new conversion have not to this day acquired intelligence to labor on their own, since they have little love of work. And one fears that with their backsliding and laziness, they may waste their time and diminish what has been gained up until now. So he decides to try a new project. Being the subdelgado and the protector of the mission, I've divided the communities, giving each one oxen and land, water and tools, etc., only with the aim of testing if the Indians of the new conversion will work their best for themselves with some love or some zeal. This passage has sort of an Enlightenment-era empirical ring to it. He's going to conduct this experiment with these two groups of Indians. But a different version of this occurs in all kinds of writing about the relationship between the Tlaxcalans and the local Indians, going back 200 years to the foundation of the first such northern colony in Saltillo. Whether in religious terms or here in somewhat more scientific terms, the idea always was that the Tlaxcalans would be a model for the local people to aspire to, that they would produce civilized Indians like themselves, and that perhaps the entire world of the North would be transformed into something along the lines of Spanish civilization. Encountering these opinions in the text and these curious population statistics, new conversion Indians coming in, more coming in on top of them, this slow layering of populations, I was inspired to start looking into the legal records that existed for this region in northern Mexico. And I will just summarize in a few sentences what I found there to illuminate these documents in the Bancroft. What I found is that the Tlaxcalans from very early on were very zealous litigants. They defended these special privileges that they had in the north from the very beginning of their time there. And they fought over property rights, the right to equip themselves for war, the rights to water, the rights to certain kinds of status and legal immunities. That was less of a surprise than what I found next. I also found that these Antiguo Borrados and Antiguo Rayados and Antiguo members of whatever tribes started to assert their legal rights in the same terms as the Tlaxcalans, that is, enumerating the ways in which they were like Tlaxcalans or like Spaniards. Their Christianity, their literacy, their command of the Spanish language, the amount of time they'd been in the area. And they also distinguished themselves from the newcomers. My notion here is that the Tlaxcalan citizenship in northern New Spain was maybe something like Latin status in the Roman Empire, a middle kind of citizenship. But it was a graspable rung in the quest for certain kinds of legal power that people who'd been around the block in the mission system for a while could get a hold of. And so, finally, I guess my perspective on what is happening in a mission book like the book of San Cristobal de los Hualohices is that it is letting us peer through and see a little bit of this social machinery by which different groups are being drawn together into this space under a Spanish rule system, but then making claims for themselves under it. And in the end, what we have here in the Bancroft is insufficient to describe this whole process or to let us know exactly what has taken place with these populations. But it gets us far closer, and at least it tells us which way it is to Linares, and it tells us a little bit about what's an Indian and what's not an Indian. Thank you.